the Institute for Government. She's now a senior fellow at UK in a Changing Europe. Jill, thanks for being with us. This is more than a war over words now, isn't it? This is Rishi Sunak taking on Boris Johnson and his allies within the Conservative Party.
Well, you could say Rishi Sunak started doing that when he resigned from Boris Johnson's cabinet last July, and actually triggered that big cascade of resignations, which ultimately brought Boris Johnson down. And that actually is, not perhaps the source of the bad blood between them, but certainly it appears that Boris Johnson holds Rishi Sunak quite culpable for the fact that he's no longer in Downing Street and that Rishi Sunak is.
So where does this end? Where does this dispute get Boris Johnson?
It's not clear at all whether this is deeply strategic or whether it's just sort of a rage against not being allowed to get his own way with his honours list. And I think, the interesting thing that's playing out now is in this sort of game of he said, do Conservative MPs and Conservative members, who we know are still by and large quite pro-Boris Johnson, are Conservative members swayed to the former Prime Minister's side, or do they side with the current Prime Minister? It's always very difficult in these meetings when you have two people's versions of events which don't tally, and none of the rest of us were there. And I'm not sure whether there was some diligent private secretary taking notes that we could all read, but we would probably only be allowed to see them in 25 years' time anyway.
Yes, and that's the point, isn't it? Some of this playing out very publicly, some of it in private. Now, Mr Sunak has tried to reunite the party, hasn't he? He's tried to bring both sides of it together and say, look, this is a new era for Conservative government ahead of those by-elections in the short term and then a possible general election next year. This is the last thing he needs right now.
I think it very much is the last thing he needs, but he may hope that this is a time when there's, lots of sunshine, lots of other things potentially going on, some great cricket to come, Wimbledon and stuff like that. He might hope that he, if you like, can concentrate all this set of rows this side of the summer recess, and then hope to come back in September with these issues resolved, settled, a Conservative Party maybe slightly smaller, but one that is united behind him, and that he can then use that as a basis to do a reset, trying to make progress on the priorities he set out earlier in the year, and give himself a bit of a chance of denting that big Labour lead we see in the polls by the time of an election, which is very likely to be in 2024. At the very latest, it could go a couple of weeks into 2025, but that would mean campaigning over Christmas. So I think, he will be hoping that you can get this through this rather gruesome period of extreme blue on blue warfare, and he can come out perhaps with his position ultimately strengthened. That will be the best case scenario for Rishi Sunak, given where things are now.
Some would say as well there are parallels with the 1990s and a lot of that division that we saw in the latter years of the major government. Do you see it like that?
Well, I was around there. I was in number 10 for a bit of the major government. I was in the Treasury for a bit of a major government. I mean, there were disputes over policy, but the sort of, when John Major expelled people he termed, in inverted commas, I'm going to say, because I know Ofcom don't like this, but the people that John Major termed the bastards, there were, it was quite difficult to manage, but he did have a relatively unified cabinet, not entirely unified. He faced a challenge when he decided to do his put up and shut up leadership challenge from John Redwood, who'd been Welsh Secretary. Did have a relatively unified cabinet. He did actually manage to make some quite big policy decisions, but even so, that could not stave off the massive defeat in 1997 to Tony Blair. So it's not a hugely welcome parallel for Rishi Sunak. So we'll see. I don't think that there was anything, although there was undoubtedly a lot of tension. There were a lot of people in the Conservative Party who felt that, the fall of Margaret Thatcher was much to be regretted, maybe even blamed John Major a bit, certainly couldn't forgive him for what they thought was going soft on her legacy. I don't think there was anything like the personal degree of rancour that we now see between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, although Margaret Thatcher no doubt was a slightly destabilising influence in her role as, what she's herself termed a backseat driver, that was more trying to influence policy than degenerating into this sort of, highly personalised spat that we see before playing out in front of us today.
Yes, it feels like it's got some way to play out still, doesn't it? Jill, really good to have you with us. Thank you. Jill Rutter there, former civil servant, now at UK in a changing Europe. Thank you.